A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. The yellow line isn't just a spray-painted mark on a map anymore. In March 2026, it has become the literal blueprint for a new reality in Gaza. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the disarmament plan recently presented to Hamas on March 15th, and it really forces us to look at whether we are seeing a genuine path to peace, or just a very sophisticated mechanism for permanent security control.
It is a massive proposal, Corn. My name is Herman Poppleberry, and I have been digging through the specifics of this text all morning. We're looking at a three-phase structure that is significantly more intrusive than anything we saw in the 24 ceasefire attempts. By the way, it is worth mentioning that today's episode is actually powered by Gemini 3 Flash Preview.
Well, hopefully, the AI has a better success rate at predicting Middle Eastern geopolitics than the pundits do. We have a lot to get through here. We are going to break down the actual mechanics of the plan, the phase timeline, and then get into the weeds on why you and I have some pretty sharp disagreements on the probability of this actually happening. And then, the big one, is this all just a pretext for Israel to stay up to that yellow line indefinitely?
To understand the pretext argument, you have to understand the sheer technical rigor of the disarmament steps. This isn't just a hand over your guns request. Phase 1 requires an immediate and total cessation of all rocket fire and tunnel construction. That is the baseline. If a single pipe rocket launches from a basement in Khan Yunis, the whole deal freezes.
Which already feels like a high bar, considering the command and control issues within various factions. I mean, how do you even guarantee 100% silence in a place as fractured as Gaza?
The plan puts the onus of internal policing entirely on the current leadership. If a rogue cell or a smaller group like Islamic Jihad fires a mortar, the IDF reserves the right to restart operations immediately. It's essentially a zero-tolerance policy that forces Hamas to act as the border guard for Israel before they even get to the negotiation table. It's a massive departure from the 24 models where relative calm was often enough to keep talks moving.
Right, and that leads us into Phase 2, where the hardware actually starts moving. This is where it gets really granular, doesn't it?
Phase 2 kicks in at the 3-month mark. This is the heavy weaponry phase. We are talking about the surrender of long-range rockets, anti-tank guided missiles, and the destruction of the remaining metro tunnel infrastructure. The plan specifically mentions that any tunnel within 2 kilometers of the border must be filled with concrete, verified by sensors.
Wait, when you say verified by sensors, are we talking about the same seismic tech they used on the Lebanon border a few years back?
They are proposing a seismic monitoring net. It's a grid of underground acoustic sensors that can detect the sound of a shovel hitting dirt from 300 meters away. If the sensors pick up digging, the reconstruction funds for that specific neighborhood are auto-locked by the system. It's a literal if-then statement written into the treaty.
And then Phase 3 is the kicker. 12 months for full demilitarization. Everything from assault rifles to personal sidearms. It basically turns Gaza into a police-free, militia-free zone where security is handled by a new technocratic committee.
The verification mechanism is what makes this different from past failures. They are calling it the Joint Oversight Commission, or the JOC. It consists of representatives from the United States, Egypt, and Israel. And here is the part that is sticking in the throat of the Hamas leadership. The JOC gets 24/7 access to any designated zone. No warrants, no check back tomorrow. If they want to inspect a school basement or a warehouse at 3 in the morning, they go in.
It is basically the IAEA on steroids, but for small arms and tunnels. But Herman, how does that work in practice? You can't just have American and Israeli officials walking into a crowded neighborhood in Shujaiya without an escort. Who protects the inspectors?
The text suggests a neutral third-party security detail, likely private contractors or a specialized Egyptian unit, but the Israelis are insisting on drone overwatch for every inspection team. So, you have this image of an inspection team on the ground, but with an armed UAV hovering 500 feet above them at all times. It's a recipe for a localized skirmish.
It's a massive sovereignty violation, which is why it's such a hard sell. And let's not forget the carrot at the end of this very long, very sharp stick. The Gaza Reconstruction Trust. We are talking about $4.5 billion in initial funding, but that money isn't just a lump sum. It is released in tranches, and each tranche is contingent on a gold star report from the JOC.
This is a total shift in how aid is handled. If you want the money for the new desalination plant, you have to prove that the rocket factory that used to be next door is now a community center. The economic incentive is tied directly to the security compliance. This is a departure from previous models where humanitarian aid was treated as a separate, unconditional flow. Here, if the disarmament stalls in month 5, the concrete for the new apartment blocks in Gaza City stops shipping in month 6.
It is a brutal form of leverage. It's reconstruction as a reward rather than reconstruction as a right. And it brings us to the yellow line buffer zone that Daniel mentioned. The proposal formally recognizes a 5-kilometer security corridor along the eastern border. Currently, the IDF is patrolling this area, and the plan essentially says they stay there until the JOC certifies that Phase 3 is complete. But as we know, there is no specific date for when that certification has to happen.
That lack of a sunset clause is a massive point of contention. If you look at the Syria 2026 buffer zone model we discussed in episode 1132, the international oversight there had a clear mandate for 5 years with a mandatory review. This Gaza plan is open-ended. It says the IDF stays at the yellow line until security conditions permit.
Security conditions permit is the ultimate diplomatic blank check. It is like telling your teenager they can have the car keys back when you feel like they are responsible. It might be next week, or it might be when they are 30. Does the text define what permit means? Is there a metric?
Not a specific one. It mentions the total absence of hostile intent, which is impossible to measure. It's a psychological metric, not a physical one. This is why the pretext argument is so strong. If you set a goal that is fundamentally unachievable, like the total removal of hostile intent, you've essentially justified a permanent presence.
Now that we've broken down the mechanics of the plan, let's turn to the question of whether Hamas can actually accept it. I've been looking at the internal power dynamics of the Hamas political bureau versus the remaining military commanders on the ground. Operationally, I think this plan is impossible for them to accept. For a group whose entire identity is resistance, handing over personal sidearms in Phase 3 isn't just disarmament, it is institutional suicide.
I agree on the suicide part, but look at the alternative. The entire territory is currently a lunar landscape. Their ability to govern is zero. Their ability to tax is zero. I've seen reports that internal dissent in Gaza is at an all-time high, not because people love the IDF, but because they are literally starving.
I'm slightly more optimistic than you, but only slightly. I'd put it at a 15% probability of a partial acceptance, not because they want peace, but because of the sheer exhaustion of the population and the collapse of their tax base. If they can frame Phase 1 and 2 as a long-term truce to get the reconstruction money flowing, they might try to cheat on Phase 3.
But the JOC is designed specifically to prevent that kind of cheating. If they keep a hidden cache of assault rifles, the Egyptian and American inspectors are supposed to find them. If Hamas accepts this, they are effectively agreeing to become a social welfare organization with zero teeth. I just don't see the current leadership signing their own pink slips. Have you ever seen a revolutionary group just turn into a charity overnight?
It's rare. Usually, you need a total generational turnover first. But think about the IRA in Northern Ireland. It took decades, and even then, it was messy. This plan tries to compress that 30-year process into 12 months. It's incredibly ambitious or incredibly naive.
Or incredibly calculated. unless the technocratic committee mentioned in the plan is just a front for a reshuffled version of the same players. But the Israelis won't bite on that. They've seen that movie before. Remember the 2005 disengagement? No verification, no oversight, and we saw how that ended. This plan is the structural opposite of 2005. It is engagement with extreme prejudice.
Having examined the likelihood of acceptance, let's play devil's advocate and ask whether this plan is really about security or something else. When you look at the red lines and the yellow lines on the map provided with the Trump board plan, it looks less like a temporary ceasefire and more like a permanent partition of security responsibilities.
If I'm a skeptic, I'm looking at that 5-kilometer buffer zone and thinking, this is the new border. Gaza is only about 6 to 12 kilometers wide in most places. If you take 5 kilometers off the eastern edge, you've essentially halved the habitable territory for the sake of a buffer.
If the IDF is entrenched there with high-tech sensors, and the JOC is the only group allowed to verify what's happening inside, Israel has effectively outsourced the headache of daily governance while maintaining a permanent kill switch on the territory's perimeter. It's a hands-off, eyes-on occupation.
The counter-argument is that after October 7th and the subsequent 2 years of high-intensity conflict, no Israeli government, left, right, or center could survive a withdrawal without these pretextual security measures. The yellow line isn't a pretext for expansion, it is the minimum viable product for Israeli security. The public demand for a dead zone between the border and Israeli kibbutzim is non-negotiable in their domestic politics.
But does the minimum viable product for security inevitably lead to the death of Palestinian sovereignty? We talked in episode 1391 about the diplomatic ghost town and the end of the two-state era. This disarmament plan feels like the final nail in that coffin. You can't have a sovereign state if an international commission has 24/7 access to your bedroom to look for a Glock.
Sovereignty has always been the trade-off in these discussions. The proposal essentially argues that Gaza can have prosperity or it can have a militia, but it cannot have both. The yellow line is the physical manifestation of that trade-off. If Hamas rejects the plan, which is the high probability outcome, then the yellow line just becomes the permanent de facto border, and the IDF stays in those corridors indefinitely.
And that brings us to the Board of Peace model we looked at in episode 862. If this disarmament plan fails because Hamas won't sign it, the international community might just bypass them entirely and move toward that technocratic governance model anyway, but without the staged withdrawal part.
That's the real trap for Hamas here. If they say no, they look like the spoilers of a $4.5 billion reconstruction deal. If they say yes, they cease to exist as a military force. It is a classic lose-lose for them, which is exactly why the planners in Washington and Jerusalem designed it this way.
It's clever, I'll give them that. They've turned peace into an ultimatum. But let's look at the second-order effects. Suppose they do accept. What happens to the internal coalition? You have thousands of armed men who have been fighting for years. Do they just turn in their rifles for a job in a JOC-approved construction crew? How do you reintegrate a fighter who has spent 10 years in a tunnel?
History suggests they don't. You usually get splintering. You get the real Hamas, or the Gaza Brigade, who claim the leadership has sold out. And then you have a security vacuum where the JOC and the new committee have to fight a localized insurgency against the very people they are trying to disarm. That is the nightmare scenario for the Americans and Egyptians involved. Imagine American inspectors getting caught in the crossfire of a Hamas civil war.
Which is why the pretext theory gains so much traction. If the Americans suspect an insurgency is inevitable, they'll want the IDF at that yellow line indefinitely anyway to act as the ultimate backstop. So, whether the plan is accepted or rejected, the result on the ground looks remarkably similar. Israeli boots in the buffer zone for the foreseeable future. It's almost as if the plan is designed to fail in a way that justifies the status quo.
One detail that most people are missing in the March 26 text is the maritime component. The plan includes a security pier that is managed entirely by the JOC. No independent port for Gaza. Everything coming in by sea has to go through the same verification as the land crossings. It is a total enclosure.
Wait, is that the pier the U.S. started building in 24?
It's the evolution of it. But instead of just humanitarian aid, it becomes the primary commercial artery. But, and this is the key, It's located right next to an IDF naval checkpoint, so even their connection to the Mediterranean is filtered through this security apparatus.
It's a smart enclosure. Instead of a wall, it's a series of digital and physical checkpoints. If you're a technocrat, it's a masterpiece of risk management. If you're a resident of Gaza, it's a gilded cage where the gold is contingent on your neighbor not having a hidden stash of grenades.
The practical takeaway for anyone watching this is to ignore the public rhetoric. Hamas is going to call this Zionist dictates and a plan for slavery. The Israelis are going to call it the only path to peace. The real metric is the first 30-day report from the JOC, which should be due in April 2026.
Right. If that report shows even a 5% decrease in tunnel activity or a meaningful handover of heavy ordnance, then we know the carrot of that $4.5 billion is actually working. But if Phase 1 is still being debated in June, the yellow line is going to start looking a lot more like a permanent border wall.
And for our listeners, that is the thing to monitor. Is the JOC actually being stood up? Are the Egyptian and American officials arriving on the ground? Because if they aren't, then this plan was never meant to be accepted. It was just a diplomatic maneuver to justify the next phase of military operations. If the inspectors are just guys in an office in Cairo looking at satellite feeds, the plan is a ghost.
It's a high-stakes game of chicken, where the prize is the literal map of the Middle East. I think the pretext argument has legs, not because the planners are necessarily evil, but because they are pragmatic. They built a plan that solves the problem regardless of the answer. If Hamas says yes, Gaza is disarmed. If Hamas says no, Israel has the diplomatic cover to stay in the buffer zone forever.
It's the ultimate heads I win, tails you lose scenario, and it fits perfectly into the broader regional shift we've seen this year. With the new order in Syria and the collapse of the old diplomatic frameworks, the yellow line is just the latest version of a new, more muscular approach to border security. It's less about a final peace treaty and more about a permanent management of the conflict.
Well, I guess we'll see if that $4.5 billion is enough to buy a change of heart. I'm not holding my breath, but then again, I'm a sloth. I don't hold my breath for much. Herman, do you think there's any chance the Technocratic Committee could actually become a real government?
Only if they can provide electricity and water more reliably than Hamas did. At the end of the day, people tend to support whoever keeps the lights on. If the JOC can turn Gaza into a functioning city-state, the resistance might find itself without an audience. But that is a very big if.
We should probably wrap it up there before we get into the even darker theories about what happens if the JOC itself gets targeted.
That's a topic for another day. Thanks for the deep dive, Corn. And thanks to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the wheels on this thing.
Big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to process all this data in real time.
This has been My Weird Props. If you found this breakdown of the Gaza disarmament plan useful, a quick review on your podcast app helps us reach more people who are trying to make sense of these maps.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all our social links. Check out episode 862 for the governance model that might replace this plan if it fails. We'll be back next time with whatever weirdness Daniel sends our way. Until then, keep an eye on the lines.
Good luck, everyone.
See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep